3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! Happy New Year indeed, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate the new year by discussing all the best horror of the old year. I've selected some great horror releases in both book and in film, and I'm going to share some of my top picks for 2025. But before we get to that, we should take just a moment to discuss the year as a whole. There's a popular claim that the ancient Chinese, wishing to curse someone, would say, "May you live in interesting times." Well, that turns out to be too cute to be true, but the saying gained popularity for good reason, because the good and the interesting are seldom one and the same, and of course I'm pointing all of this out because, for me at least, 2025 has been interesting. That's not to say it's been all bad or anything. There have been some great moments. But you might have noticed I've been seeming to have been slacking off a bit in posting regularly to this channel. I'm perfectly willing to take plenty of the blame for that myself as a personal failure, but I'm also going to point to a variety of circumstances beyond my control, which have dominated an inordinate amount of my time these last several months. And a lot of that's personal, so I'm not going to share too many details, but suffice it to say, for now at least, that a lot of things have been going on, and while I'm not necessarily finished dealing with all of those, I am committed to doing better at bringing more videos to y'all on a more regular schedule, so do be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss out on any of those, because being more active here is one of my most important New Year's resolutions. But what about the year in the horror genre itself? The genre at large? Was this a great year? A miserable year? One that was somewhere in the middle? Honestly, I think somewhere in the middle, but one thing I think we can all agree on is that it's been a weird year in horror. In fact, when I sat down these last several days as I'm recording this to start compiling my best of the year lists, which we're getting to shortly, my first instinct was to say this was not a very good year in horror at all. Yeah, I could think of a few decent horror movies, but compared to some years where the struggle is really to sort through too many masterpieces, this year just didn't seem to have all that many masterpieces at all. Well, the good news is, when I got to it in more detail, what I discovered was that there were actually plenty of movies I enjoyed, and some that I would even call masterpieces, but they seem to have been front-loaded toward the beginning of the year rather than the end. The major releases that came out around Halloween, for instance, mostly didn't impress all that much. So, it's not that 2025 was a terrible year for horror, it was just a weird one in terms of scheduling, with more of the better films coming earlier in the year rather than later in the year when we would really expect them to be. Still, even accounting for that, it wasn't the best year on record either. Some of the most anticipated big new releases ended up flopping either at the box office or in my reviews, or both. And I just didn't end up finding enough of the little indie treasures to fill in all of the gaps. Again, I think that's probably partly my own fault because my mind has just been elsewhere. But I've been watching a fair amount of horror, and I do also think that this was just something of a slow year for the genre. Add to that some of the true genre greats we've lost this year, and it's been bittersweet at best. And then, of course, there was the closure of the Horror Pack subscription service. You might have noticed I didn't make my usual Christmas video sitting by the fireplace and opening the gift that I've received from the Horror Pack company, and that's because they're out of business. One company does not an entire genre make, of course, but that could easily be seen as a sign of the times, both in the horror genre particularly, and for physical media in general. I certainly hope I'm wrong, and for whatever it's worth, I'll keep fighting to make sure I'm wrong, but it does leave a bit of a foul taste in my mouth about the whole year. Nevertheless, despite all of the bad things, there have been some triumphs as well. I do have some great horror books and some great horror movies selected for you. For the movies, I even managed to pull together a true top 5 list, complete with some honorable mentions and a number 1 selection that I'm going to pick as my best of the year. But before we get to that, let's talk about the books, because here, instead of counting down the top 5, I just picked several that I think are worthy of mention. I do happen to have 5 of them, but I'm not counting down a specific top 5 in order with a single top pick of the year chosen, and I'm not picking out a bunch of honorable mentions. Part of that was just that I honestly didn't read a ton of new horror this year. I was focused largely on the classics, and while that makes for a great year on my own personal reading list, it doesn't do wonders for this best of the year list, because the rule is the book or the movie has to have come out in 2025. As such, instead of counting down 5 books and picking a single best one, I just want to mention the few best horror books that I personally read this year in no particular order. First, of course, are all the ones I published. I genuinely do think those are the best of the year, or else I wouldn't have put my company's logo on them, but I also don't think it would be appropriate for me to pick them for this list because, hey, I guess I wonder which ones are going to be best of the year. Maybe it's these ones and that would dominate the whole list. That would be inappropriate, it would be unfair. So I'm going to mention them now, but then I'm going to disqualify them from the remainder of the list that I'll be getting to in just a moment. And so in order of their publication, those books are Ghost Girls and Rabbits by Cassandra Windwalker, a psychological horror thriller novel about a grieving mother whose daughter has been missing for years, and so she becomes so desperate and arguably insane that she does the unthinkable to try to bring her daughter back. Then there's Bright City Shattered by Millie Abecassis, a science fiction murder mystery of sorts. Less of a horror novel, but still, I think, pleasing to a horror audience, in which this security officer, just starting her new job at this retro-futuristic power company, has to figure out whether a sudden and unexpected death within the company was an accident, a suicide, or a murder. For those of you who like non-fiction with your horror, there's my own 3rd volume in the Case Files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society series, in which we present our findings from now more than 25 years of paranormal investigations, complete with all the stories of ghosts and aliens and demons, along with all of the histories of the locations under study, and then the results of our own research. And then there's Where the Pretty Things Rot by Henry Snyder, a collection of horror short stories. Now, if you like classic horror, these are the stories for you, and they present an almost complete cross-section of what the genre has to offer. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Cerulean Sky by David Corse, which is a dystopian science fiction, horror, dark fantasy, romance, or something of the sort. But don't let that make it sound too disjointed. It's hard to classify the genre, but the world building here is excellent, especially for such a short book. This is about a mysterious illness that turns people incorporeal. When a character gets infected, she has just days to put her affairs right, while also running from these government agents who are pursuing her because she's got infected and then run away. So those were my publications for the year, and I should mention that autographed copies of all of these can be found at polymathpress.com. You can also get them at any other bookstore. And there's a lot more to come on that front next year. I'm still in business, I'm still going along, I have a lot of exciting plans. And, of course, I genuinely do believe all of these are at the top of the literary list this year, but I did promise to be more appropriate and to mention several others without any personal connection to myself or my business. So let's put these aside and let's look at my true top 5 of the year list. Now, taking these in no particular order, I'm not ranking them from 5th to 1st or from 1st to 5th. I'm just presenting they're all at the same level. These are my top books of the year. And the first one I want to single out is The Clatterman by Janelle Shaika. This one is about this group of friends at a sort of cabin getaway, and they accidentally perform a ritual from urban legend to summon the Clatterman. Now, this obviously has shades of Bloody Mary and Candyman, but it does feature an original villain, the Clatterman, with his own summoning ritual, and it's just perfect for those of us who have always loved urban legend, real urban legend, and urban legend in horror stories, or who just grew up with these kinds of old stories, either in fiction or, as I say, in urban legend. One of the things I particularly liked about this one was the summoning ritual itself. It borrows from the familiar tropes around such things as Bloody Mary or Candyman, as I've mentioned, but then it carries it to the extreme in a way that I've never quite seen before. It's a true original summoning ritual, and I quite like it. If you grew up on 80s horror in particular, maybe even 90s horror, you are going to love this one. Easily one of the best of the year. Next, I want to mention one that got a wider release. I think it was actually one of the ones that I got from the Nightworms package earlier in the year. That's a horror book subscription service. Anyway, the book was called The Sundowner's Dance by Todd Kiesling. This one is about an elderly widower who moves into a retirement community after his wife's death. And I'm not talking about a live-in, assisted living sort of a facility. I'm talking about individual houses, but a planned community for retired people. But once he gets moved in, he discovers something isn't quite right in his new neighborhood. For one thing, he's got a neighbor with dementia who's behaving in all kinds of weird ways. He has an overbearing HOA president. And then he starts seeing hints of something supernatural going on in the neighborhood. Now, what I love about this one, aside from it just being a good novel and well written, which it is that it taps directly into two of my own personal deepest and darkest fears: dementia and homeowners associations. I don't think I really need to explain why I have such a fear and hatred for either of those two things, but I can tell you this book does a great job both of exploring them in a literary form and using them as a jumping off point for true horror. Arguably, it was a little familiar and predictable, but I don't care. It was still a great and enjoyable read, and it really seemed to be speaking directly to me and to my own fears and what would you say, intellectual prejudices. That's certainly enough to earn it a place on my best of the year list. Next, for something just a little bit different, I'm picking on Elvira's Cookbook from Hell. Obviously, this isn't a true horror book. It's not a horror novel or a collection of short stories, but it is horror themed. And this is just such a beautifully presented book. I think most of us would be proud to have it in our libraries. I'm certainly proud to have this amongst my cookbooks. And I also quite liked the selection of recipes. Y'all know I love a good horror-themed cookbook. I like a good cookbook in general, and horror-themed is all the better. But this happens to be a good cookbook in its own right. That's important. As much as I like a horror-themed cookbook, if the recipes aren't good, the theme doesn't carry it. This one has good recipes. It's a little heavy on snack foods and finger foods and hors d'oeuvres, but it does still have a good selection of entrees and desserts and some cocktails and even some crafts that you can build if you're setting a table for a Halloween party or something like that. And I think those home chefs among you are going to like this one. Speaking of cookbooks, my next selection isn't a cookbook, but it's written by two authors who've written some of my favorite horror-themed cookbooks in the past. The book is Splinters of Azathoth, a collection of short stories by Mike Slater and Miguel Flager. Full disclosure that one of the stories in this collection, actually the title story of all things, was also featured and first published in my own Arithmophobia anthology last year, but though that means I knew in advance I was going to like one of the stories, that doesn't mean that I let it color my review overall. The fact of the matter is, these authors have become two of my favorites working in the genre today. They're masters of presenting mostly Lovecraftian horror in such a way that it pleases both the Lovecraft purist and the modern horror fan alike. Some of the stories are quieter, some are gorier, some are scarier, and some are funnier. But while there are, of course, a few that I like better than others, there's not a bad story in the bunch. This was a late addition to my list this year. It was in my December reading, so I really just read this quite recently, and I haven't even included it in one of my monthly review videos yet, so stay tuned for that. It's coming within the next week or so, and in there I will give you a more complete review along with everything else that I read in actually November and December, 2 months this time because family emergencies put me just a little bit behind at the end of November and beginning of December. But rest assured, that's going to be a rave review for this book. The other books are interesting too, so you're going to want to stay tuned. It's going to be a rave review for this one, and the book clearly deserves to be featured on this best of the year list. Finally, again, last but not least, I want to tell you about Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm by Blake Myers. Believe it or not, this was actually a debut novel, which makes it all the more impressive that it was one of my favorites of the year, but here we are. Debut or not, good work is good work, and this is indeed good work. I think a big part of what intrigued me about this, and what I loved about reading it, was how it blends a real true crime story, a real urban legend, and a fictional ghost story all into one. Anyone who's either been around this channel for a while or read any of my own books knows that I love both ghost stories and history. And in fact, true crime. And so blending them all together is a great way to get my own attention. But what's great here is that they're blended so, I don't want to say seamlessly, but almost seamlessly, that the book will please the true crime people as much as the ghost people, as much as the history people, without ever really feeling too disjointed or schizophrenic. Yes, it does occasionally alternate between the 2 or 3 subgenres or plot lines rather than blending them 100% at every stage, but by the end it all comes together into a coherent whole. It's like a soup whose individual ingredients are still identifiable, but the whole thing works together as a single unified dish. And so there we have it, 5 of the best horror novels of the year, or I guess I shouldn't say novels, horror books. One of them is a collection of short stories, one of them is a cookbook. 5 of the best horror books of the year. I'm not absolutely saying they are the 5 best of the year, because admittedly there are plenty I didn't get around to reading this year, but they're my 5 best, which certainly means they're going to be among the 5 best regardless. Again, along with my own publications, of course. That brings us, of course, to the best horror movies of 2025. And I really had a hard time with this one, but I did finally manage to come up with a list, though I think this is going to be one of those years in which none of us are probably going to agree with each other's rankings. There's a lot of controversy around some of these, but before I get to them, though, let me just take 5 or 10 seconds to remind you to click the thumbs up, leave me a comment, subscribe, ring that bell, and share my videos as far and wide as you possibly can. One of my goals for this year is to really grow this channel, and I can't do it without your support, so please do all of those things, and you have my gratitude in advance. But let's go ahead and talk about the movies. The way I'm going to do this is pretty much the same as I've done these last several years, and that's that I'm going to present my top 5 horror movies of the year. 4 of them will be in no particular order. I'm not counting down from worst to best or anything, just no particular order. But then I will single out my number one absolute favorite movie of 2025 at the very end, so make sure you stay tuned all the way until then. Now, the first one I picked out, not the number 1, but the first of the 5, is one that I think a lot of people are going to put at number 1, but while I agree it was one of the best movies of the year, obviously I'm putting it on my list, I don't think it quite made it all the way to the very best of the year, and that was Sinners. The thing of it is, this was an almost perfect vampire movie. When they added the extra layer of, I guess you would say, magic in terms of the music, I thought that was also great. And the soundtrack, in fact, is great. The problem was that trying to keep both of those plots together, the vampire and the music, left it feeling a little bit like it didn't quite know what it wanted to be. Mostly they worked well together, but they sort of butted heads on occasion, and that sort of hurt the film a little bit. Nevertheless, except for a couple of scenes here and there which just felt extraneous, this is the kind of horror I want to see a lot more of. Something that breathes a bit of new life into an established trope, like vampires, is always welcome. And I love a movie that pays attention to things like plot and acting and cinematography instead of just always going for the gross out. And I love that it was a slow burn enough that we got to really know some of the characters before the real horror got started. That makes it a lot more... That raises the stakes when you care about the characters, whether you like them or not, but when you care about them, when you're interested in them before the horror gets started, then the horror is all the more horrific. That was all great. Probably the weakest point was the scene toward the end. I'm not going to spoil it, but I'm going to say the scene toward the end with the Klansmen, which seemed shoehorned in just to satisfy some fantasy on the part of the filmmakers, because they'd already really addressed the Klan issue right at the beginning of the film, when the characters acquired their new business and it was a success. And then beyond that, the Klan never really had anything to do with the rest of the plot. It didn't have anything to do with the vampires or the music. And so it was really only there to provide a context for the social era in which the film takes place. So climaxing with that, I think, was a mistake. That said, it's a damn good movie that could have been just a little bit tighter, but easily earns a spot in my top 5 of the year. Next is one I don't think a lot of people are mentioning on their top movies of the year lists, and that was Locked. Some of you might even be sort of scratching your heads because I think it came and went with such little fanfare that a lot of you might have even missed it completely if you didn't happen to catch my own review or a couple other people's. This is the one in which Bill Skarsgård plays a thief who breaks into a luxury car only to find it's being remote controlled and he's locked in and completely at the mercy of the car's owner, portrayed by Anthony Hopkins. So why is this one on my list? Well, for one thing, Anthony Hopkins can do no wrong. Put him in a bad movie and he'll make it a decent movie. Put him in a mediocre movie, he'll make it a good movie. Put him in a good movie, he'll make it a great movie. The same is true here. The movie itself is good, but his performance really made it great as far as I'm concerned. And that's not to give Skarsgård too little credit here either. The two of them together managed to make a truly exciting experience out of watching a guy locked in a car for a couple of hours, which is impressive. But I also admit the reason it's on my top 5 list instead of maybe being an honorable mention might be a personal reason. My own car was broken into just a couple months before I saw this film, and of course the police did nothing about it, just as has been the case for Anthony Hopkins' character in the film. And so, while I may not condone what he did, I certainly understand the desire to take matters into one's own hands. And there may have been some element of catharsis or wish fulfillment somewhere behind my own particular enjoyment of the film. But on the other hand, by the end, we do come to sympathize with the thief at least as much as or more than the car's owner. And that's probably a good and valuable reminder to all of us that mercy without justice is cruelty to the innocent, but on the other hand, justice without mercy similarly robs the guilty of the chance to make appropriate restitution and to put their lives right. Even still, it was as cathartic in the first half as it was thought-provoking by the end, and it's just a fun ride. It was a fun one to watch, so easily makes it onto the list. Now this next one is going to be a controversial one. This was a real love it or hate it kind of a movie, and I think my horror fan friends are just about evenly divided on whether they loved it or hated it. And I came in a little bit more in the middle, but I'm obviously skewing more to the loved it side, even though I can point out some flaws. But that's enough said for now. The film I'm talking about, my next pick, is Weapons. Now, don't get me wrong. I see all the flaws in the movie. I really do. The ending completely jumped the shark, and that scene at the end, you know the one if you've seen the film, that scene at the end really needed yakety sax in the soundtrack, and that they didn't put that in the soundtrack, well, a missed opportunity, but that also tells you something about the way the film ended. Not to mention, the actress who played Gladys seems to think for some reason that she's not the villain, which is just about the dumbest thing I've ever read. But despite all those flaws in the film itself and in the marketing and interviews and things around the film, I still really liked the movie overall. Think about it in terms of the first two acts. They were really great. Here we had a fairly original premise for a horror movie, well acted, well produced, decidedly creepy, and with characters we could really understand and care about. That has become so rare in the horror genre. I think a lot of us are willing to call this a favorite movie of the year, as I am, even despite the flaws toward the end, simply because we're so desperate for good original storytelling that's not a remake, not a reboot, not a sequel, and not just a formulaic attempt to recapture the magic of some other film. And so, yes, I will also criticize the ending of Weapons, but put that aside, it is still one of the top 5 horror films of the year. And the next one I think will be less controversial. My next pick for my top 5 was Good Boy, the one that's told from the dog's perspective. Here again, I'm not saying this was a perfect movie by any means. Maybe it was a little formulaic in some parts. Some of the scares were maybe just a little bit stale. But the premise of doing the whole thing from the dog's perspective was just a stroke of genius. I also have to admit part of the reason I'm including it on my list is in fact because I don't give specific awards for Best Actor. If I did, Indy the dog would obviously win. As it stands, though, because I don't give such a individual award for such specific categories, the strength of Indy's performance is enough to carry the movie into one of my top 5 slots. And on that topic, I'm calling on the entire horror genre right now, and everybody watching this, we need to boycott any awards show that doesn't give Indy the Best Actor award. The next one will be my number 1 pick for the year, but before we get to that, I do have a few honorable mentions I want to single out that didn't quite make it into my top 5, but need to be recognized either as a near miss or for some specific reason or another. The first of those is Final Destination Bloodlines, the new Final Destination movie. Overall, it was a decent, good movie. Not bad at all. And it was a worthy entry into the franchise, which I'm still a fan of, but probably not good enough to win any big awards. With one exception. Tony Todd's scene in that movie got me right here. And if I were to judge just a single scene on its own, without regard to everything else around it, that scene with Tony Todd, his sort of goodbye scene, would be my pick for Best of the Year without question. That is the best horror scene of the year. And yeah, the rest of the film, it still has all those creative death scenes that we all have come to know and love from the Final Destination franchise. It's good. Overall, the film is not quite top 5 material. It might be honorable mention material anyway, but Tony Todd's scene, best horror scene of the year. My next honorable mention is Death of a Unicorn. I went into this one with zero expectations, and it ended up being surprisingly good. Certainly not best of the year material, but surprisingly good for a movie with a title like Death of a Unicorn. And as much as I take issue with some of the formulaic elements of its screenplay, and I do, if you look closely enough, you'll realize that the whole thing is so full of alien references that it almost qualifies as a fan film. A friend of mine's actually started to call it an alien fan film, and that gave me just enough of a chuckle to earn an honorable mention for that reason. And then there's The Monkey. It's not a great movie, but it's not trying to be. This one gets an honorable mention because it was just the kind of over-the-top, ridiculous fun I was looking for on the day I went to see it. It was the right film at the right time. Not great, but it was what I needed. In fact, it seems to borrow some of its sensibility about death scenes from the Final Destination franchise, and I'm pretty fond of those, so I'm pretty fond of it too. That brings us to Ash, a science fiction horror movie that came out pretty early in the year. It's about an astronaut who awakens on a distant planet to find that her entire crew is dead, and rather gruesomely so, but she has no memory of how she got there or what has happened. What follows is a surreal cosmic horror with some extended self-indulgent visuals that, while fascinating and well done, admittedly got on my nerves a little bit. But what follows is also a deep and thoughtful science fiction horror story that dared to give us something different from everything else we've already seen before. So, a lot of credit and an honorable mention for those reasons. My next honorable mention goes to The Ugly Stepsister, the Norwegian black comedy body horror twist on Cinderella. I think this one's actually going to be on a lot of people's top 5 lists, and for good reason, even though it didn't quite get there on my own list. A lot of people are saying it's the only film, or certainly one of the only films, with such disturbing visuals that they couldn't even watch it. To those people, I say they're clearly not seeing enough horror movies because, while somewhat extreme, especially by Cinderella movie standards, this is far from the most extreme movie I've seen. It's probably not even the most extreme this year, if I come to think about it. But it does get a lot of credit for being overall amazingly produced and for putting a fresh twist on such a familiar classic. And my final honorable mention goes to one I actually just watched a few days ago, and that was the Korean film Revelations. At its most basic level, this is a missing person mystery thriller following a pastor and a detective who each have some personal stake in the case as they navigate the whole matter. I'm trying to say this without spoiling too much. But what it really is a thought-provoking look at a lot of deep and important issues, psychological issues. Yes, it's a bit disjointed at times. That's a criticism I have seen others make, and it's a fair criticism. But it gives us a strong look at grief and guilt and faith and justice through these fascinating characters. It easily could have made my top 5, but it ended up being more of a mystery thriller and less of a true horror movie. So after a bit of struggle as to whether it was horror enough or not, I decided we're going to go with the honorable mention. We're going to honor it, but we're going to keep to true horror movies for the top 5. And that brings us to the moment we've all been waiting for. My pick for the number 1 horror movie of 2025. I thought long and hard about this one because I think a case could be made for pretty much any of the ones that I put already on my top 5. Even beyond those, I think a good case could be made for some of the other ones that didn't get included, either in the honorable mentions, maybe even some that I didn't choose to honor with an honorable mention. There's a case to be made for several films. But at the end of the day, I have to go with my instincts here. And so my pick for the best horror movie of 2025 is drum roll please. And this is the point at which I would insert a drum roll if I happen to have that audio asset, but I don't. So do your own drum roll please. And the best horror movie of 2025 is Bring Her Back. Now, one thing I liked about this is that it's original. By that I mean, first and foremost, that it's not just a cash grab attempt to capitalize on established franchises. But I also mean it's original in its own plot. Yes, I did find it a bit predictable, and that was my only big criticism of it. But even at that, I don't recall ever seeing a movie quite like this one before. So I like that a lot. It may have been a little predictable just because I've seen so much horror, and I know all of the tropes. But this particular combination of tropes, I hadn't seen before. This felt new, and I appreciate that. More importantly, though, it's just really well done. All the acting and the production value and the cinematography, all of it are great. But for me, it's the script I most care about, because I love a film with such strong character development that we really care about the people we're watching. We need to care about the people or the horror doesn't mean anything, and this film delivers that in spades. And then there's that scene with the knife. I won't spoil it if any of you haven't seen it yet, but if you've seen it, you know exactly which scene I'm talking about, and you know exactly why that scene has lived rent-free in so many of our heads all year. For those of us who watch as much horror as I do, the ability to create a scene that still gives me a Wiggins deserves a lot of credit. And I'm not going to say it cost me sleep or anything, but that scene gave me a Wiggins, and it deserves some honor. And so that was my pick for the best horror movie of 2025. And so there we have it as we come to the end of this video. My best horror books and movies of 2025 in the bag. We'll have to see. I'm sure this is going to spark some controversy because there's no way I can read and watch everything, so there's a good chance I've missed out on something great. If so, be sure to let me know down in the comments. And even if we did happen to read and watch all of the same things, I'm sure opinions vary. I know some of these are controversial opinions. I'm ready for it. So please feel free to discuss. Just do try to keep it all civil. We may disagree, but we're all here because we love the horror genre. So as we discuss and as we debate and as we argue, as we should, let's keep that in mind. And I, for one, can't wait to see what horrors the new year might bring, just as long as they stay on the page or on the screen instead of in our real lives. I'll be back soon to talk more about our favorite genre, but until then, allow me to be the first, or at least among the first, to wish you the happiest new year, and as always, take care and stay scared.